Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
I gotta tell you something, Wyatt. I told your brothers when they went off to fight, and I suppose the time's come for you. You know, I'm a man that believes in the law. After your family, it's about the only thing you got to believe in. But there are plenty of men who don't care about the law. Men who will take part in all kinds of viciousness and don't care who gets hurt. In fact, the more they get hurt, the better. When you find yourself in a fight with such viciousness, hit first if you can. And when you do hit to kill.
That was a scene from Lawrence Kasdan's 1994 biopic Wyatt Earp, which we'll be discussing today on How the West Was Cast. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, before we continue, keep in mind that our discussion of Wyatt Earp will include some spoilers throughout the show, so if you haven't seen the film yet, you might want to consider watching it before listening to this podcast. Okay then, with that out of the way, Andrew, why don't you set things up and give us some context into Wyatt Earp?
At the end of the 1980s, Kevin Costner was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Having acted in Silverado, Lawrence Kasdan's high-spirited and highly reverential 1985 Western about a group of misfit gunfighters, Costner now wanted to not just star in, but produce and direct his own epic Western, Dances with Wolves, about an Army lieutenant living among the Lakota. Dubbed Kevin's Gate by industry observers who predicted the first time filmmakers' movie would bomb, Dances with Wolves was a surprise hit, winning 6 Academy Awards and briefly reigniting Hollywood's interest in Westerns. Costner then set his sights on his next Western project, a biopic of legendary lawman Wyatt Earp. Working with Jim Wilson, his Dances with Wolves producing partner, and Kevin Jarre, screenwriter of the acclaimed Civil War drama Glory, Costner wanted to tell the story of Earp's life beyond the famous events of Tombstone, Arizona, events depicted in numerous earlier films, including the genre classics My Darling Clementine and Gunfight at the OK Corral. Costner and Jarre soon disagreed about the direction of the story. The screenwriter saw the greatest dramatic potential in the interplay between Earp and his allies, in particular with the dentist-turned-gunman Doc Holliday. Costner envisioned a sweeping narrative centered on Earp's personal journey. Jarre departed, and Costner and producer Wilson, along with new screenwriter Don Gordon, continued to develop the project as a 6-hour television miniseries. In 1992, they approached Kasdan about directing. Kasdan wasn't interested in a miniseries, but he offered his services if Costner would agree to let him pare the script down to a 3-hour feature, the same length as Dances with Wolves. With Kasdan now on board as director, co-writer, and co-producer, Costner and Wilson set the project up at Warner Brothers, which had released Clint Eastwood's Oscar-winning Western Unforgiven in 1992. Wyatt Earp was filmed largely in New Mexico in the summer and fall of 1993. With Costner in the lead, the movie features a massive supporting cast of familiar faces, including Dennis Quaid as Doc Holliday, Gene Hackman as Earp's father Nicholas, and Michael Masden as brother Virgil. The film was released on June 24, 1994, 1 week after The Lion King and 2 weeks after Speed, both of which trounced Wyatt Earp at the box office. Reviews at the time also didn't help. Critics did praise the film's cinematography and production design, along with Quaid's performance as Holliday. They also at least acknowledged the film's ambition to offer viewers a more comprehensive and complex version of a well-known American legend. Beyond that, though, it was open season. Notices disparaged everything from the film's lengthy running time, slow pace, and uneven plotting, to the lack of character development, to James Newton Howard's pompous score, to the phony-looking wigs Costner wears while portraying Earp in his younger days. Wyatt Earp was out of theaters by August. Come awards season, the film scored 1 Academy Award nomination for Owen Roizman's cinematography and 5 Razzie nominations, winning the prizes for Worst Remake or Sequel and Worst Actor. The film's critical and commercial failure helped signal to Hollywood that the Western's days were once again over, and it would be a decade until a substantial number of Westerns would once again grace our movie screens. Looming over Wyatt Earp, both in 1994 and in the years since, is a competing film about the famous lawman, Tombstone, written by, that's right, Kevin Jarre. Tombstone was released exactly 6 months before Wyatt Earp, and as critics at the time acknowledged, it was almost impossible to evaluate the latter without invoking the former. Tombstone not only got better reviews and earned more money, it went on to become a classic, especially in the eyes of fans of the genre, many of whom hold it in higher regard than any other Western of the past 3 decades. Wyatt Earp is remembered as the other Earp movie from the 90s, if it is remembered at all. Critics have been wrong about Westerns before, of course. Consider Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's infamous Western about the Johnson County War, and a film that Wyatt Earp seems to invoke in small ways. Upon release, Heaven's Gate was so poorly received that its studio withdrew it. But, while still controversial, the film is now regarded by many as a serious, ambitious work that was out of step with Hollywood's focus on action and spectacle. Is Wyatt Earp maybe another Heaven's Gate, or is it what critics said it was, ambitious and flawed?
Wow, there is a lot to unpack there. But let me just say up front, I love Wyatt Earp. Honestly, I've seen this movie from start to finish at least 8 times since it came out. For me, it's right up there with the best Westerns of the 90s. I mean, I understand the problems that some people have with it, but personally, I'll take it over Tombstone any single time. Now, I like Tombstone. It's very entertaining and quotable, but for me, it doesn't have the depth that this movie does.
Now, I also think Tombstone is actually a little bit overrated, and maybe we can save that conversation for a future podcast. But I am not as enthusiastic as you are, Matt, about it. Although I should point out, it was my idea for us to start with this film because of something I wrote in my book, Still in the Saddle, about the film, which is not about Wyatt Earp, but there's one line in there that you took issue with. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah. When I first read your book, I read your book before we ever interacted on social media and got to know each other. I just experienced it through reading it, and I loved it until I got to that one page. I don't even know the page number, but I shouted out while I was reading it. I said, lumbering? What are you talking about? Lumbering. He described Wyatt Earp with the one-word phrase, and that always did kind of like, it was a little tough to deal with.
Yeah, it's not a film I've written a lot about, and certainly have only really made that one judgment and that word. And I guess not to give away too much, but having now not only rewatched the theatrical version, but also the extended version in preparation for this conversation, I feel very good about my choice of adjective.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that one. Okay, for this episode, we've each chosen 5 key elements of the film that we want to highlight and discuss. Now, these can be anything from a specific performance to a favorite scene to maybe a line of dialogue or a theme that we think is especially noteworthy. So, Andrew, what's your number 5?
So my number 5 is the first gunfight we see in the movie. This takes place within the first half hour when the young Wyatt Earp and his family are on their wagon train west, and Wyatt and a friend are sent into town for supplies. And there, outside of a bar, he sees a violent confrontation. And what I like about this is how authentic it is. Historical accuracy is never, a great way to judge a film, and every Western makes some claim implicitly or explicitly to be more historically accurate. But I think this one scene has a claim to be an accurate representation of what gunfights really were. It's a couple of drunken guys who spill out of a bar. They awkwardly draw their pistols from their belts. They shoot. They don't shoot to kill right away. Both men die agonizing deaths. A horse is shot. To me, it's really striking. I don't think it works in terms of setting up the narrative that follows. But I find that one scene and the way it's depicted and the way it's staged really quite effective. I think this is one of the moment that can legitimately say that's probably how it really happened.
It's kind of shocking when we see that scene because one of the guys gets shot in the groin, which is unusual in a film like this. And the horse death, you're right.
Exactly.
Overall, the violence in this film, it impresses me. The scene with Ed Masterson being shot and that wonderful moment where his clothing bursts into flame from the close-up pistol fire seems incredibly accurate as well.
There's a lot of great details. It's especially in the amount of times that the characters miss when they're shooting, and also how quiet the gunshots are, where we're used to hearing movie gunshots, especially in Westerns, being like cannons. Right. But here it's legitimately that popping, we get some of the smoke. So I think in this respect, the film really came through.
Even in the OK Corral scene, I love that people are being shot in the wrist, and yes. People are being shot and they do those wonderful, old school Dick Smith style squibs blowing up on people's extremities. That kind of, those little touches like that, I think really elevate it for me.
I agree.
You boys can get me. That won't be any problem with all the guns you got here. But I'm taking 10 or 12 of you with me. Starting with you, Dick Bird. And you, McGee. Maybe you too, Harvey.
Okay, so that's my number 5. Matt, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is the fireworks scene. Now, I'm a real sucker for a good fireworks scene in a movie. There's a beautiful one in Woody Allen's Manhattan, and there's a real stylish one in Skyfall, and there's a great one, a truly beautiful one in De Palma's Blowout. But the one in Wyatt Earp is really special, I think. It happens right after Wyatt hits Ed Ross in the throat with that cue ball. He takes Ed's gun from him and goes outside with Téa Leoni to watch the fireworks. And when you look at that scene again, notice that it's the exact moment where Wyatt gets bit by the gun bug. You can tell that he likes the way that pistol feels in his hand. He draws it 5 times as he points it and gets used to how it comes out of the holster. And then check out the way Téa Leoni looks at him in that moment. She kind of casually glances over, and you can tell that she's seen this before. It's like watching someone do heroin for the first time. Like, she sees this is not going to end well, but it's a rite of passage and he's got to do it. While overhead, the sky explodes with red, white, and blue fireworks. When he takes aim at those fireworks and says boom, it recalls that moment at the beginning of the movie when, as a young boy, he was taking aim at the moon with his father's rifle and pretending to shoot the moon. Now, as a young man, he's taking aim at the symbol of America itself. I just think it's a terrific scene. It's a little bit on the nose, but visually it's captured so beautifully. There's not a lot of dialogue to it. It's just a visual poetry.
I like parts of that scene a lot. I like the low camera position as Leone and Costner exit, and they begin to walk across, and the camera sort of slowly follows them, but we see them quite small relative to the size of the fireworks. It is quite beautiful. But for me, the scene doesn't work so well. It's kind of like my number 5, that we have a very beautifully, impactfully staged scene, but then what's happening to the characters in it, to me, doesn't seem equal to the kind of grandeur of what we've been seeing. To me, his infatuation with the gun at that moment seems, I don't know, maybe a little bit too happenstantial. It's very odd in a way that he's gone from, disarming someone using his wits and then slowly being seduced. To me, that contrast is a little bit too, I guess, convenient.
Yeah, and it's also odd that he already had a pistol tucked in his waistband when he confronts Ed. He doesn't pull that, so it's not like he's never been around a gun before. But something I think about taking it off of that person, and that's another question I had for you. We see so many scenes in Westerns of people disarming each other, and then the people who have lost their gun just kind of go away. And these days, when I think about somebody trying to take someone's cell phone away from them or something like that, there's no way somebody's walking away without that object. So is that just a thing that movies always do, or is there any basis in reality to that?
I mean, there is some basis in reality for lawmen posting signs on the outskirts of town that there's no carrying allowed or that they had to check their guns, but not to the degree that we see in almost every Wyatt Earp movie where it becomes a plot device.
Okay, so what is your number 4?
So my number 4 is a line of dialogue that every time I hear it, I think is just one of the greatest lines I've ever heard in a Western. And it's said by Téa Leoni's character, Sally. As I said in the introduction, there are so many familiar faces in this movie. And many of them do a lot with what is very little screen time. So she plays a prostitute who is trying to seduce Wyatt, but at this point in the movie, he's not interested because he's got a girl back home. And she watches, before he becomes enamored with his sidearm, he becomes enamored with his first game of Pharaoh, sitting down at the table, and he's actually successful. And she says, and I think this is just a great line, "At least upstairs, I'd be making some money."
That's a good one. Yeah. You're right about the cast in this film. It's like every role is filled. I think one of my favorite is seeing Urilla's mom from Little House on the Prairie. It's right. Mom. It's so great.
Or a young Jim Caviezel shows up
right
late in the movie. It really is a remarkable cast.
Yeah, Jeff Fahey showing up.
To me, it's just a shame that so many of these people have so little to do in the movie, but maybe we'll get to that in a bit.
Okay, so my number 4 is James Newton Howard's score. Now, I know you, in your intro, used the word pompous to talk about it.
I'm paraphrasing reviewers at the time.
Well, clearly I am not one of those critics. Just the opposite, in fact. And I'd say that along with his score to M. Night Shyamalan's Signs, which I think is brilliant, I think James Newton Howard really created a masterpiece here. It's the kind of music I like in a film. Instead of getting a Hans Zimmer style soundscape or some kind of understated atonal score like we heard a couple of years ago in that Western Hostiles, which suits that film, but it's a little bit minimalistic in a way. In Wyatt Earp, instead, we're treated to this huge orchestral score filled with sweeping emotion and grand gestures and recurring themes that develop over the course of the film. This is really like a sprawling score that's both exciting and tender at times. And it evokes like a pastoral motif in addition to action and violence. Surprisingly, James Newton Howard, this is his only Western score, I think. And I can't imagine the film without it. But what's your take on the score?
I have some sympathy to critics who were perhaps growing a little bit tired by the end of the film of those same 4 bars of music over and over again. But I actually quite like the score. I was listening to it the other day just on its own, and I think it's really quite beautiful. What I also like about it is that it's actually a theme. It's something we don't see in Westerns as often today as we did in the past, where there was a recognizable theme that went along, particularly with the protagonist. And it was variable depending on the mood of the particular moment in the film. So that I quite like. The one incongruity, I think, is that on the one hand, we have what is a very classical, very traditional type score for a Western, in a Western that is in many ways trying to not be a classical Western, is trying to tell you this is the way it really happened. So to me, it's an interesting, again, kind of conflict within the film between something that on its own actually works quite well, but then when you actually look and see how it's influencing the narrative, maybe there's some friction there.
What I want to do right now is play a cut from the soundtrack. Now, this is a short piece called Dodge City, and it's one of my favorites.
My number 3 is all of the other characters in the movie except for Wyatt Earp. I find that all of the characters, including the family that Wyatt claims to care so much about following his father's edict about family early in the movie, are in fact strangers to us. Early in the film, lawman Fred White is murdered, but we don't even know who he is as a character. After Morgan is killed, Doc says, "I love that boy like he was my own little brother." But we've barely seen them interact over the course of the 2.5 hours of screen time to that point. Now, it's interesting the way that this movie almost single-mindedly focuses on Wyatt, and that makes it very different than a lot of Westerns. A point I've made in some of my criticism of the genre is how Westerns from the 1950s have tended to focus on buddies, people who are kind of polar opposites. So Tombstone's Earp and Doc Holliday would be an example of the way this works, but we see it in a lot of other Westerns. The recent Lone Ranger would be one as well. Even Unforgiven in the central pair does this. But Wyatt Earp doesn't, and I think that's notable. And maybe you could make an argument then that the film's treatment of the other characters surrounding Wyatt, the kind of superficial treatment of them, is in fact a reflection of Wyatt's own disposition towards them. But no, when Doc Holliday just emerges in Tombstone, there are some moments that we just don't spend a lot of time with these characters. We do see a lot of the Earp women, and critics at the time certainly noted, and I think this has been noted since, that it's actually interesting to see these women confronting Wyatt. But even there, we don't really know who they are as people or as characters. So it's strange to be able to say that about a movie that's over 3 hours long, that you know so little about the people you've been spending that time with.
You're right about the wives, though. I think they do have that. They always surprise me in this film. Some of the things that they're allowed to get away with. They help point out what a thug he is, what a thug Wyatt Earp is, and how unlikable he is, and that we're on their side, especially in 2020. They seem like they're making more sense than anybody else. But it's Costner's unlikability that's actually my number 3. I proudly admit I am a huge late 80s, early 90s Costner fan. That was a terrific period of movies. I mean, you've got things like Silverado, The Untouchables, No Way Out. This list goes on. Bull Durham, Field of Dreams, Dances with Wolves, The Bodyguard, JFK. I mean, JFK's in the middle of that. Eastwood's A Perfect World. And these were all in like a 7-year period. This is an amazing run of movies. And, I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I've seen The Bodyguard. It's a go-to classic for me. So by the time Wyatt Earp came out, I think Costner was really overdue for a critical drubbing, especially post Dances with Wolves. And you just can't stay on top that long, I think, without taking a few knocks. And he was Teflon for a long time, and a huge box office star, which makes his choice to play Earp as such a cold, unlikable, reptilian, quote, hero, I think a bold move in his career at that time. And for me, it really pays off. I really like seeing that darker, grim side of him. His performance always reminds me of the last line in Roger Ebert's review of Scarface. It's one of my favorite reviews he wrote. He sums the entire film up in that final line saying, "It's a wonderful portrait about a complete louse." And I feel like that sort of sums up Costner's performance for me. And so I really dig that part. And the sad thing is, this movie was a tipping point in his career. Its reputation kind of clung to him for the next several years, and he followed it up with things like Waterworld and The Postman, and never really entirely bounced back to where he was before making this film. It became more of a character actor at times, and that's too bad, I think, because I love the risk that he took here, and I wish it had paid off more for him. His everyman quality, that quality that people loved about him, that affability, is totally non-existent in this film, and I suppose that really hurt him. After this, he started playing villains for the first time in his career in 3,000 Miles to Graceland and Mr. Brooks. So this is really a turning point for him, I think, and it's still a performance that I really enjoy.
I think it's interesting to think about his performance here in relation to A Perfect World, the Eastwood film, because in that film, he certainly doesn't go where he goes in this picture, but he's not outright heroic. Do you think that role and the fact that he was able to be successful in that might have emboldened him to think, oh, I can do this. People are going to accept me.
I think you're right, because they kind of came one after another.
Yeah.
And it is like a trial run for it. That character still has so much. The audience really does love him until he starts losing touch with reality in that film. He's so hugely charming, which he isn't in this film. He's also looks so different between those two movies. He's beautiful in A Perfect World. He looks like he's right out of a James Dean movie or something. He's trim and you can see that light in his eye. And here he's a bear of a man. He packed on some weight for this film, which I think, seeing the size of him, especially when he's lying in bed with one of his wives or something, he just looks like this enormous creature. And in a way, the film itself, this kind of unwieldy giant movie, mirrors his body. He's like this huge immovable object. So yeah, I can see a Perfect World being a trial run for Wyatt Earp.
I think that's a great observation about the physicality of his performance. I think, not always successfully, but the early scenes do try to capture some of the litheness that he demonstrated throughout the 1980s, particularly in those horrible wigs, trying to make us think of him in Silverado, let's say. But, speaking of the bed scenes, when you contrast the first scenes with his first wife with the later ones with Josie, he does take on a different physicality. He's certainly a much larger man. So I agree that he's trying to do things here. For me, what doesn't really work about that is the motivation for why he is the way he is. I think the film tries to, as many Westerns do, present us with this character who's walking the line, so to speak, who understands the importance of the law, but then also knows that he needs to exercise a certain degree of unsanctionable violence in order to maintain order, which is very conventional. I come out of the film even thinking I don't know that much about him to begin with. We spend so little time, for example, with his father. It's interesting that Gene Hackman gets the second billing in this movie, but I think he's on screen for all of 10 minutes. He's kind of reduced down to some almost platitudes that to me don't provide enough to explain why Earp is the way he is. But in rewatching the film, I think what maybe the film is trying to do is suggest that Earp is not a man who was really in control of his fate, but was more shaped by the events around him. And to me, that's very interesting. I think that's where the film is going. I don't know if it quite gets there, but that is one of the more interesting things in the movie to me.
Yeah, you're right about Gene Hackman's limited role, but I think the scenes that we do see him in are key scenes. Those platitudes that he gives him. We hear in the film that he's been doing this forever, that everybody has these things memorized. So there's sort of a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing going on, I think, with Wyatt, where he's just bought into these ideas of his father for so long. And when you couple that with Urilla's death, I do get just enough to see why this kind of playful younger guy becomes this unfeeling Terminator, basically.
Well, that leads pretty well into my number two, which is the plotting of the film. The film covers a lot of territory, about 35 years in the life of this famous character. And let's say 30 of them are ones we haven't seen a lot of on film. And that's interesting in and of itself. But early on, the film is incredibly elliptical in its storytelling, to the point of maybe being more anecdotal. And even when the film settles down into Tombstone, Arizona, to tell a more cohesive narrative that takes place over a defined period of time, it doesn't really shake that elliptical narrative when it comes to motivation, us understanding the connections between characters, us understanding the Clantons, for example. Why are the villains in this movie the villains? To me, there's not enough there. Even the idea that Earp is simply projecting his worldview onto all of these different characters that he encounters, that he assumes anyone with a gun, as his father cautioned him, is a potential threat, and so you need to intervene aggressively. To me, there isn't enough there, and I find myself kind of lost and drifting. Again, maybe like Earp himself, but I don't know.
Yeah, it does play a little loose at times, but I'm a big fan of the biopic genre anyway, whether it's music biopics or anything like that. And the larger the expanse of time that they cover, the better for me. I like those kind of catalogs of the greatest hits, whether it's, NWA forming or Bohemian Rhapsody or something like that. Take me from babyhood to old age in a film, and I'm with you. So that's something I like about it, that kind of structure. And also those weird little moments, like that whole, I wonder if there was were there any thought given to not having the Mastersons story put in there? It just kind of stands out as this unusual little interlude in the middle of the film. And there are a few sections like that where it becomes episodic in a way. And yet I find that really generous that we get these extra little sequences that any other movie would probably just cut out, because what does that have to do with him necessarily? I
really like the scenes with the Mastersons, actually. I think Tom Sizemore and Ed Pullman are actually really terrific. And some of those scenes of the buffalo hunting, and particularly the skinning, those are things we'd never seen on film before. To actually see the hide being ripped from the carcass of the bison is really powerful stuff. So I quite like a lot of those. But to me, those are then at odds with the idea that there's some kind of, overarching philosophy that guides Wyatt Earp. To me, that's where the tension is. One thing I guess maybe I'll ask you is every time I see this film, there are a couple of wipes in the movie. There's one in the pool scene, and then there's another at the railroad, and they're just these wipes from left to right that kind of come out of nowhere. And I don't know if that's Kasdan having a Star Wars acid flashback, or
I think that's how I would think of it. I mean, it does capture that sort of roadshow picture vibe where it's these kind of epic films that would have an intermission in them. You would see that sort of thing. And but yeah, it's definitely feels very Star Wars to me, which makes sense with Kasdan behind the camera.
I guess maybe the other thing I might say too is it's interesting the things that they decide not to put in there. So, there are other more potentially despicable things that Earp did. There's some debate about this, but he may well have worked as a pimp in Peoria, Illinois for a time. So I wonder why that isn't in there. But to me, the biggest thing that's missing, given where the film goes at parts, particularly in the conversations that Earp has with Josie about legends and truth and so on, is we don't see Earp's time in Hollywood at all. So Wyatt Earp famously spent some time in Hollywood and even interacted with someone like John Ford. So, we know that My Darling Clementine is accurate because that's how Wyatt Earp said it happened. So there are places that the film doesn't go, which I find interesting.
You're right. The that part about him possibly being a pimp in real life, and seems it's so at odds with this film where he's criticizing his brothers for having relationships with saloon girls. But from what I had read in some of the bios on him, it was part of his life. He grew up around. He had an affinity for gambling, and his dad more of a deadbeat kind of guy. Then he comes across as uber upstanding in this film, but that wasn't my impression of the actual figure.
No, I mean, without going into too much detail, Nicholas Earp was not the paterfamilias that he's depicted as in this film, certainly. So, as I said before, every Western implicitly or explicitly makes some claim to be more historically accurate. And I think in many ways this film succeeds, but it's always interesting what persists from the genre's history and what is subject to quote unquote revision.
So moving on, my number 2 is the epilogue of the film, and specifically its connection to one of my favorite Westerns, Heaven's Gate. Now, in your introduction, you mentioned that Wyatt Earp seems to invoke Cimino's film in some ways. Well, that's certainly true in that last scene, I think. Both Wyatt Earp and Heaven's Gate end with our heroes on boats, thinking heavily about their past. Wyatt finds himself off the coast of Alaska, while Chris Christopherson's character is off the coast of Newport, Rhode Island. And both men in these scenes are with their wives, but neither wife is actually their first choice. For Wyatt, Urilla was the love of his life, at least according to the film, but she died tragically. And for Christopherson's character, Isabelle Huppert was his muse. She was everything, and she died in his arms as well. So the women are both sort of also-rans in this sequence, while both men are much older, and they're both haunted by their violence in their past. Christopherson is sort of broken by the whole experience. He's seems like a shell of the guy that we have been watching for this long, long film. He's more or less at this point sold out his idealism after the tragic events that he went through, and now he's become a very rich man, but he seems deeply unhappy, while Wyatt is just kind of struggling to figure out what it all meant. I mean, maybe in a way like you were in watching the film. But I find it really interesting, too, that these two highly landlocked movies that are about, especially Heaven's Gate, I mean, that's about that land, suddenly toss their heroes out to sea. And the endings mirror each other in such a curious way. I was wondering, what do you think of that? Am I reading too much into that connection?
No, I don't think so. I think this film is keenly aware of Heaven's Gate. And given that it was made in the early 1990s, we should remember that Heaven's Gate's reputation had by that point already improved considerably. There's also something to be said for Costner maybe wanting to tempt fate. The idea that people thought Dances with Wolves was going to be the next Heaven's Gate, and he proved them wrong. So maybe between that track record and the fact that critics and fans of the genre had begun to come around to Heaven's Gate by that point, maybe they felt like there would be an appetite for this type of film. So I can't help but think that they're aware of it. I think your observation is a really good one. The difference that I would point out is that in Heaven's Gate, Marshall Averill, Chris Christopherson's character, begins in the East with that famous scene in Harvard, and then he has his adventure out west. But at the end of the film, he's retreated east. In fact, he's gone so far east that he's in a boat off the East Coast. Whereas Wyatt Earp has continued west. He's gone so far west that he's at now almost the last frontier, Alaska. And that's certainly in keeping with what we see throughout the film, where there's just this idea that Earp wants to go west because that's where independence is, financial independence. So it makes sense in the context of both films. To me, Heaven's Gate is a much more forceful, emphatic rejection of everything that not only the Western, but maybe the American West is supposed to be.
So what is your number one?
My number one is a Marvel Comics What If. I love to think about what ifs when it comes to film history. One of the things I like the best are kind of the dead ends, the roads not taken, where you can look back in film history and you can say, well, if things had just been a little bit different, I wonder what might have become of this film or films that might have been like it. So my what if for Wyatt Earp, I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, what if this had not been a 3-hour feature, but had instead been a miniseries? Because for me, at 3 hours, it feels superficial. As I've said, we don't really know the supporting characters. I don't think we know Earp himself that much. I find a lot of the motivations to be underdeveloped or even kind of cliche, which is odd for a film to be relying on these generic shorthands when it's trying to present us with a more plausible depiction of history. So I have to wonder, and I was wondering this intently as I watched the film, what might have happened had this been a miniseries. Now, that is kind of impossible. It kind of raises the larger question of, what if you had Lonesome Dove, but you didn't have Dances with Wolves within a couple of years after that? Right? What if there had become, there was a more greater appetite, let's say, for long-form Western storytelling on television? Could this have been there? So that's my big what if. And to me, there's enough in the film to suggest that this could have been a really excellent 6 hours.
Was there a venue for it on TV, or would we have been stuck with the broadcast TV version of Wyatt Earp, which I feel like the material is not going to play as well there. Even the Hatfields and McCoys played on basic cable, that miniseries, and was able to sort of push the boundaries more. I'm not sure what was going on in
the first Lonesome Dove airs on CBS over a couple of nights. So I guess I'm thinking about it like that. I mean, that has Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall in it. That's a beloved Western at this point. So that just isn't possible after Dance of the Wolves. No one's interested in making big Western TV shows when you could potentially make an Academy Award winning film. And that's certainly what Warner Brothers has to be thinking.
Now, my number one is something you sort of mentioned in your introduction, which is the expanded edition. You see, for people listening to this, if you didn't already know, Wyatt Earp, as long as it is, there's also a longer version out there that runs 20 minutes longer than this theatrical release. That's a lot of extra time to spend with Wyatt Earp, but I think it's kind of worth it. I'm usually not that fond of director's cuts, although this isn't actually called a director's cut. It's expanded edition. Apparently Kasdan was perfectly happy with the theatrical version, so we just have this expanded version. Normally, I like to stick with the theatrical versions of films. They're the ones I return to over and over again, with maybe the exception of Cimino's movie, The Sicilian, where we get the European cut is so much richer. I mean, that's just a completely different film, basically. But with the expanded version in the United States, it was released on Laserdisc and VHS. It still hasn't come out on DVD and Blu-ray. I'm doubtful that we'll ever see that there. I owned the VHS edition for a long time. It came on 2 tapes bundled together. It was letterboxed. Yeah, I had that one. So supposedly Kasdan prefers the longer version, but just doesn't want to dub it the director's cut. Some of the additional scenes in it include like a sandstorm that the Earps face on the wagon train. There's a couple of new scenes between Wyatt and Urilla, and there's a tense moment with Wyatt and the Mastersons when they encounter some Sioux Indians while they're skinning their bison. And there's also a face-off that's really nicely done between Wyatt and the brother of a cowboy that he killed. Plus, you get more scenes with Doc Holliday. So overall, these changes help. They help the story flow a little bit better and explain a few little relationship things here and there, especially with Urilla, and why her death hits him so much harder than we would expect it to, having seen the theatrical cut where they barely spend much time together. So if you love the movie as much as I do, which might be doubtful, I'm thinking, you might want to check eBay or Amazon and find a used copy of the expanded edition of Wyatt Earp.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I would recommend the longer version. I think that it does work better, and especially those scenes with Urilla. In the theatrical cut, there's this kind of strange transition between them being very happy and then all of a sudden they're unhappy, and you're a little uncertain about why that is. Is it because she's sick? Is it because they can't conceive? I mean, you don't really know. And the additional scenes between the two of them, there was some really nice conversation, which I think helps to, as you said, explain why it is that Earp reacts the way that he does, which seems over the top in the existing cut, but makes a lot more sense in the other one. And then to your point that, reinscribing the presence of Native Americans, I think is really interesting. I could understand why you would excise it because that isn't a part of the film at all. But putting them back in there makes that scene, the buffalo hunting scene, all the richer.
Okay, then. Andrew, any final thoughts on Wyatt Earp?
Well, Matt, I'm glad that you made me watch this film again, if only to confirm in my own mind that this is indeed a lumbering picture. One thing I think is worth saying, though, it's that in hindsight, we should acknowledge that Wyatt Earp is the rare miss in Kevin Costner's body of Western work, which of course now includes Open Range, The Hatfields and the McCoys, Yellowstone, The Highwaymen. To be fair, Costner has probably done more for the Western than anyone else in Hollywood over the past 30 years. He was inducted into the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum's Hall of Great Western Performers in 2019. So whatever Wyatt Earp may be, it certainly is only one misfire in a career of great Western movies. Now, have I tarnished the film at all, or is that even possible?
No, it's not possible. I'll give you this. I admit that it's not particularly fleet-footed. I'm not going to commit to lumbering, but I see your point. Well, that about wraps things up for this episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.